U.S. President Donald Trump has defied protesters, taking a short walk outside of the White House towards St. John's Church, which was damaged in the recent demonstrations. Now, heavy security cleared the path for the president there as he made his way and his entourage to the church and back to the White House. Now, President Trump denounced acts of domestic terrorism following days and days of protests over the police killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd. Well, his brazen move follows a Rose Garden statement he gave moments earlier in which he vowed to protect Americans and keep them safe, calling the unrest a total disgrace. Well, Mr. Trump said he's ordered state governors to act to bring those responsible to justice.
Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Well, Mr. Trump spoke with governors in a video conference earlier in the day. He slammed their inaction, calling them weak. He urged them to dominate the situation and jail those stirring trouble. But not all agree with his strategy to curb the unrest.
And I also shared with the president that a posture of a force on the ground is both unsustainable militarily, it's also unsustainable socially, because it's the antithesis of how we live. It's the antithesis of civilian control. So I expressed that on the call.
The desperation follows a sharp escalation of violence since Friday, which forced the Secret Service to rush Mr. Trump into an underground bunker as violent demonstrations erupted just outside the White House. Though the situation on Monday appeared calmer, dozens of cities across the U.S. remain under curfew. The National Guard has been called out in at least 23 states to help restore order, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency says there's significant ongoing unrest in at least 36 cities. On Monday, Terrence Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, visited the site where his brother died a week ago. He called for calm, even as an independent autopsy showed George Floyd died from suffocation, not only because police officer Derek Chauvin lodged his knee at his neck, but also because other officers helped pin him down. Well, the Minnesota coroner has since declared George Floyd's death a homicide.
I understand y'all upset, but like it was already said, I doubt y'all half as upset as I am.
Come on now, speak.
So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff,
come on.
If I'm not over here messing up my community,
Come on. Mess up yours.
then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
Well, for the latest, Simon Marks, our U.S. Bureau Chief, is joining us live from Washington, D.C. So, Simon, Mr. Trump taking that walk outside the White House, calling protesters domestic terrorists and ordering state governors to act to quell the violence. So what kind of message is President Trump trying to convey here, and will it work?
Well, he's trying to convey symbolically through that walk through Lafayette Park that he is taking control personally of America's battle-strewn streets. But this was a mixed message that the President of the United States presented here tonight, because on the one hand, he described himself as an ally of all peaceful protesters. But even as he was articulating those words, within earshot of the president, military police were being sent into Lafayette Park directly opposite the White House. They were firing tear gas at peaceful demonstrators, and they were moving them out of the park specifically So President Trump and his entourage, including the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, the president's daughter, Ivanka Trump, and the president's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, could take the short walk across Lafayette Park to St. John's Church, a building that is historic here in Washington, D.C. Every president since Abraham Lincoln has at some point worshipped there, and it is a landmark building that was slightly damaged by fire as a result of those protests 24 hours ago. So, astonishing scenes, the president describing himself as an ally of peaceful demonstrators everywhere, even as he was sending the military police into the park to use tear gas and force to disperse peaceful demonstrators so that he could take a walk through the park and head over to that church. It is now just after 8:15 here in Washington, D.C. We're an hour and 15 minutes into the curfew that was supposed to begin at 7 o'clock. There are still large numbers of protesters on the streets of Washington. And I think really one major outstanding question, given what President Trump has announced tonight, his resolve, if necessary, to deploy the U.S. military in towns and cities all over the country to restore peace and suppress demonstrations. Are members of the military willing to accept those orders? Will they fire on peaceful protesters if they are ordered to do so by the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Armed Forces, namely Donald Trump? And what are other key figures in the president's entourage, including Vice President Mike Pence, who notably did not take that walk across the park to the church? What are they thinking about where this country is heading tonight?
Yes, and Simon, in the meantime, the Minnesota coroner has ruled George Floyd's death a homicide. Though his brother Terrence Floyd has called for calm. I mean, he did. Could this, of course, maybe trigger more outrage over racism and also police brutality?
Well, what Mr. Floyd was calling for was for the protests to continue taking place, but he wanted the looting to stop. And everybody wants the looting to stop, including, of course, members of George Floyd's family. Look, there are now two medical reports, one by the official medical examiner, saying that George Floyd did not die as a result of asphyxiation at the hands of police, but as a result of pre-existing medical conditions, including a heart ailment. A second report conducted by a medical examiner independent of the state and hired by the family, who ruled today that absolutely Mr. Floyd was asphyxiated at the hands of police. The coroner ruling this a homicide. One detective of the team of detectives that were assigned to arrest George Floyd is, of course, now facing third-degree murder charges, but the family thinks he should be facing first-degree murder charges, and many people in Minneapolis will not rest unless and until the other members of the police force who were deployed alongside Officer Derek Chauvin last Monday to arrest George Floyd are themselves brought into custody and face charges. So the protests in Minneapolis and in other parts of the country over the George Floyd case are by no means over yet. And more broadly, President Trump may have breathed new life into protests across America, even as he is vowing to suppress them and take back control of the country's streets.